They say you never truly understand the power of faith until you witness something that defies every law of nature you thought you knew. My name is Dr. Michael Anderson, and I am a cardiac surgeon who graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School with over 15 years of experience in operating theaters across America. I used to be what you'd call a hardcore materialist, someone who believed that if it couldn't be measured, tested, or proven in a laboratory, it simply didn't exist. I was the kind of doctor who rolled his eyes when patients mentioned prayer, who considered religious faith nothing more than psychological comfort for the weak, and who took pride in being what I called a rational man of science. Growing up in Detroit, Michigan, I was surrounded by working-class families who found solace in their churches, their rosaries, and their unwavering belief that someone greater was watching over them. My grandmother, Maria Gonzalez, was particularly devoted to Our Lady of Fatima. She had immigrated from Portugal when she was young, carrying with her not just her few belongings, but an unshakable faith in the miraculous apparitions that had occurred in that small Portuguese town over a century ago. Every evening, she would kneel before a small statue of Our Lady of Fatima in her modest living room, her weathered hands clutching a worn rosary as she whispered prayers in Portuguese that I never bothered to understand. As a teenager, I found her devotion embarrassing and antiquated. While she prayed for miracles, I buried myself in science textbooks, determined to understand the world through logic and empirical evidence. I excelled in my studies, graduated summa cum laude from the University of Michigan, and went on to medical school with the absolute conviction that human knowledge and scientific advancement were the only tools. We needed to heal the sick and solve the world's problems. My grandmother would often tell me, "Miguel, one day you will see that there are things beyond what your books can teach you." But I would just smile politely and change the subject, convinced that her faith was nothing more than the product of an uneducated mind clinging to outdated superstitions. My career flourished exactly as I had planned. I became one of the youngest cardiac surgeons ever hired at Cleveland Metropolitan Hospital, a prestigious medical center known for handling the most complex heart surgeries in the Midwest. I was arrogant, I admit it now, but back then, I saw my confidence as justified. I had steady hands, an analytical mind, and a success rate that made my colleagues respect me, and my patients trust me completely. I lived for those moments in the operating room when I could repair what seemed unrepairable, when I could restart a heart that had stopped beating, when I could give families hope through my skill and knowledge alone. My wife, Jennifer, often joked that I had a God complex, but I didn't find it funny because, deep down, I believed she was right, and I was comfortable with that belief. Everything changed on a cold February afternoon in Cleveland, when the ambulance brought in Sarah Mitchell, a high school student who had collapsed during basketball practice. Her heart had gone into sudden cardiac arrest, and by the time the paramedics got her to us, she had been without oxygen for nearly 8 minutes. Her parents, David and Rebecca Mitchell, were the kind of people I had grown up around but had learned to tune out over the years. They were simple, hard-working folks who ran a small bakery in the suburbs. And the moment they arrived at the hospital, Rebecca pulled out a small prayer card with the image of Our Lady of Fatima and began praying with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Doctor," she said to me, with tears streaming down her face, "I know you're going to do everything you can, but I also know that Our Lady is going to guide your hands. She's going to bring our Sarah back to us." I nodded professionally, the way I had learned to do with emotional family members. But internally, I was already calculating the odds. 8 minutes without oxygen meant severe brain damage was almost certain, even if we could get her heart beating again. This wasn't going to be one of those miraculous recovery stories that people loved to tell. This was going to be a tragedy that would destroy this family. And no amount of prayer was going to change the cold, hard medical facts. The surgery began at 3:30 in the afternoon, and everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Sarah's heart was damaged far more extensively than our initial tests had indicated. There were multiple areas of dead tissue. Her electrical system was completely chaotic. And despite our best efforts with every advanced technique and piece of equipment at our disposal, we couldn't establish a stable rhythm. For over 2 hours, we worked with the desperate intensity that comes from knowing that a young life hangs in the balance. Trying every procedure in our extensive repertoire, calling in additional specialists, and pushing the boundaries of what was medically possible. But sometimes, medicine isn't enough. Sometimes, despite all our training and technology and determination, we reach the limits of what human hands can accomplish. At 6:15 in the evening, after nearly 3 hours of fighting for Sarah's life, Her heart stopped responding to our efforts entirely. The monitors went flat. The room fell silent, except for the mechanical sounds of the machines that were no longer helping. And I felt that familiar weight in my chest that comes with losing a patient, especially someone so young with so much life ahead of them. I looked around at my surgical team. Dr. Patricia Williams, my anesthesiologist, who had worked with me for years, Nurse Janet Thompson, whose steady hands had assisted me through hundreds of operations, and Dr. Robert Chen, the cardiologist who had helped with the more complex aspects of the procedure. Their faces reflected the same exhaustion and defeat that I felt. We had given everything we had, and it hadn't been enough. Time of death, I said quietly. 6:17 p.m. The words felt heavy coming out of my mouth. Not just because of the clinical finality they represented, but because I knew that in a few minutes, I would have to walk out to that waiting room and tell David and Rebecca Mitchell that their daughter was gone. But then something happened that I still struggled to put into words. Even now, several years later, as I began to remove my surgical gloves, preparing to face what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of these parents' lives, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The room, which had been lit by the harsh, sterile fluorescent lights typical of operating theaters, suddenly seemed to be filled with a different kind of light altogether. It was warm and golden, almost like sunlight filtering through stained glass windows, and it seemed to be emanating from directly above Sarah's still form on the operating table. I blinked hard, thinking that maybe the stress and exhaustion of the long surgery were playing tricks on my vision, but the light remained, growing stronger and more defined. And then, in the midst of that golden radiance, I saw her, a figure of a woman, beautiful beyond description, wearing robes that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Her hands extended toward Sarah with a gesture of infinite compassion and love. Her presence filled the entire room with a sense of peace so profound that, for a moment, the usual sounds of the hospital seemed to fade away completely. "Are you seeing this?" I whispered to Dr. Williams, not taking my eyes off the incredible sight before us. She looked at me with concern, clearly worried about my state of mind. "Seeing what? Michael, are you feeling all right?" I turned to the others, searching their faces for any sign that they were witnessing what I was witnessing, but their expressions told me everything I needed to know. They saw nothing unusual. The miraculous vision that was unfolding before my eyes was meant for me alone. The beautiful woman in the vision looked directly at me, with eyes full of such love and understanding that I felt like she could see straight into my soul, past all my pride and skepticism and arrogance, to the frightened human being underneath who had spent his entire career trying to play God, but who was now face to face with something infinitely greater than himself. And in that moment, without anyone touching any equipment, without any medical intervention whatsoever, Sarah's monitor began to beep again. Her heart, which had been completely still for over 4 minutes, started beating with a strong, steady rhythm that seemed impossible given everything we had just witnessed. My surgical team sprang back into action with a mixture of professional training and stunned disbelief. Dr. Williams immediately began checking Sarah's vital signs while Dr. Chen monitored the heart rhythm that had mysteriously returned to normal. Nurse Thompson adjusted the equipment with hands that I noticed were trembling slightly, though whether from exhaustion or something else entirely, I couldn't tell. The vision of Our Lady of Fatima had faded as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the usual harsh hospital lighting and the steady beeping of monitors that now showed signs of life where moments before there had been only the flat line of death. We completed the surgery in what felt like a dream state. Everything proceeded normally from that point forward, as if the previous 4 minutes of cardiac arrest had never happened. Sarah's heart responded perfectly to our remaining procedures. Her blood pressure stabilized, and all her vital signs returned to levels that would be considered excellent for someone who hadn't just experienced what should have been a fatal cardiac episode. When we finally closed her up and wheeled her to recovery, I found myself walking behind the gurney in a daze, my mind trying to process what I had just witnessed while my medical training insisted that there had to be a rational explanation for what had occurred. The walk from the operating room to the family waiting area felt longer than usual that evening. I had made this walk hundreds of times before, sometimes with good news, sometimes with devastating news, but never with the kind of confusion and spiritual upheaval that I was experiencing now. David and Rebecca Mitchell were still in the same chairs where I had left them hours earlier, but Rebecca was no longer crying. Instead, she was sitting peacefully with that prayer card in her hands, and when she looked up at me, approaching, her eyes held a calmness that seemed almost supernatural given what her family had been going through. Dr. Anderson, she said, before I could even speak. She's going to be fine, isn't she? The certainty in her voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the desperate hope of a terrified mother. This was the quiet confidence of someone who had received assurance from a source beyond human understanding. I nodded, still struggling to find my voice after everything that had happened. Yes, I managed to say, Sarah is going to be fine. The surgery was ... successful. I couldn't bring myself to tell them about the death and resurrection I had witnessed, about the vision that had appeared in the operating room, about the fact that by every law of medicine and biology, their daughter should have been brain dead from oxygen deprivation. Rebecca smiled with tears in her eyes and handed me a small medallion that I hadn't noticed her holding, along with the prayer card. This was my grandmother's, she said. She brought it with her when she came to America from Portugal many years ago. She always said that Our Lady of Fatima watches over doctors who have good hearts, even when they don't know she's there. I looked down at the medallion in my palm. It was old and worn smooth from decades of handling, and it bore the image of the same woman I had seen in the operating room, surrounded by the same golden light that had filled the space above Sarah's body during those impossible moments when death had been reversed. The days following Sarah's surgery were among the strangest of my professional life. She recovered with a speed that defied everything I knew about cardiac medicine. Patients who experienced the kind of damage Sarah had sustained typically face months of rehabilitation, potential cognitive impairment from oxygen deprivation, and a long list of complications that can arise from such extensive cardiac trauma. But Sarah was sitting up and talking coherently within 18 hours of the operation. Within 3 days, she was walking around the cardiac unit, chatting with nurses and asking when she could go home. Her heart function tests showed no signs of the damage that should have been evident after what she had endured. My colleagues were puzzled, but attributed her rapid recovery to her youth and physical fitness from playing basketball. They talked about how young hearts are more resilient, how athletes have better baseline cardiovascular health, and how sometimes medical science encounters cases that fall outside the normal statistical expectations. I listened to their explanations and nodded along, but deep inside, I knew that what had happened to Sarah Mitchell had nothing to do with statistics or youth or athletic conditioning. What had happened was something that my scientific training had not prepared me to understand or accept. At night, alone in my study at home, I found myself doing something I hadn't done since I was a child. Forced to attend church with my grandmother, I began to pray. Not the formal, memorized prayers of my Catholic childhood, but simple, honest conversations with a God I had spent decades denying. I would hold Rebecca Mitchell's medallion in my hand and try to make sense of what I had experienced. I read everything I could find about Our Lady of Fatima, studying the historical accounts of the apparitions to the 3 shepherd children in 1917, learning about the thousands of documented healings and miracles attributed to her intercession. Over the past century, my wife Jennifer noticed the changes in me immediately. "You've been different since that Mitchell girl's surgery," she said one evening, as we sat together on our back porch, watching the sunset over Lake Erie. "You seem, I don't know, more thoughtful, more present." I had always been the kind of husband who brought work stress home, who stayed late at the hospital not because I had to, but because I enjoyed the intellectual challenges of complex cases. But now I found myself leaving the office earlier, spending more time with Jennifer and our 2 children, 8-year-old Emma and 12-year-old James, really listening to their stories about school and friends instead of just half hearing them, while mentally reviewing surgical procedures. One Saturday morning, Jennifer suggested something that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. "What if we started going to church again?" she asked tentatively. We had stopped attending Mass years earlier, partly because of my skepticism, and partly because Sunday mornings had become the only time our busy family could sleep in and relax together. But something in her suggestion resonated with a part of me that was awakening after years of dormancy. "Maybe that's not such a bad idea," I heard myself saying, surprising both of us with my response. Our first Sunday back at St. Anthony's Catholic Church in Cleveland Heights felt awkward and foreign, like visiting a place where I had once lived but no longer quite belonged. The rituals and prayers came back to me gradually, muscle memory from childhood rising to the surface despite decades of neglect. But during the consecration, as the priest elevated the host and spoke the ancient words of transformation, I felt something stir within me that I hadn't experienced since I was a boy sitting next to my grandmother, trying to see the world through her eyes of faith, rather than through my own eyes of skepticism and doubt. Emma and James were initially resistant to the idea of weekly church attendance, but they adapted quickly, the way children do when they sense that something important is happening in their family's life. James, who had always been fascinated by science and had inherited what Jennifer called his father's analytical mind, surprised me one Sunday by asking if I thought God worked through doctors to heal people. I told him carefully that God works in ways we don't always understand. And sometimes that includes working through people who dedicate their lives to helping others get better. The changes in my medical practice were subtle but significant. I began spending more time with patients and their families, really listening to their concerns and fears, instead of just focusing on the clinical aspects of their conditions. I found myself offering comfort and hope in ways that went beyond medical reassurance, drawing on something deeper than my surgical expertise. When patients asked if I believed in miracles, I no longer deflected the question with scientific explanations about statistical anomalies and unexplained recoveries. Instead, I told them that I had seen things that convinced me that healing sometimes comes from sources beyond human understanding. One of my colleagues, Dr. Amanda Foster, a cardiologist who had worked with me for over a decade, pulled me aside one afternoon after a particularly difficult case. "Michael," she said, "I don't know what's happened to you lately, but whatever it is, it's made you a better doctor. You've always been skilled, but now you're compassionate in a way you weren't before. Your patients notice it. The nurses notice it. We all notice it." Her observation made me realize that the transformation I had experienced wasn't just personal. It was affecting every aspect of my professional life as well. 6 months after Sarah Mitchell's surgery, I received an unexpected phone call that would complete the circle of my spiritual awakening. It was Father Rodriguez from St. Anthony's, asking if I would consider speaking at a special evening service about faith and healing. "We have many parishioners who are struggling with illness, either their own or that of loved ones," he explained. "I think your perspective as both a doctor and a man of faith could offer them comfort and hope." The idea of speaking publicly about my experience terrified me, but I also felt a compelling sense that this was something I was meant to do, a way of giving back for the extraordinary gift I had received in that operating room. The night of my testimony at St. Anthony's arrived, sooner than I felt ready for. But as I stood at the podium looking out at the faces of nearly 200 people who had gathered to hear about faith and healing, I felt a peace that I recognized from that moment in the operating room when everything had changed. Among the crowd I spotted Sarah Mitchell sitting with her parents in the third row. Her bright smile and healthy complexion, a living testament to the miracle we had all witnessed in different ways. She had returned to basketball, was excelling in her senior year of high school, and had been accepted to Ohio State University on a full academic scholarship. Her dreams completely intact, despite having technically died for 4 minutes on my operating table. As I began to speak, telling my story of transformation from skeptical surgeon to a man who had witnessed the impossible, I noticed something remarkable happening in the audience. People were not just listening, they were connecting with something deeper than mere curiosity about a medical anomaly. Elderly parishioners nodded with recognition. Young mothers wiped away tears, and I could see in their eyes that many of them had their own stories of unexplained healings, answered prayers, and moments when they had felt the presence of something greater than themselves intervening in their lives. After the service, the response was overwhelming. Person after person approached me with their own accounts of miraculous recoveries, divine interventions, and answered prayers. Maria Santos, a woman in her 70s, told me about her grandson, who had been born with a severe heart defect that doctors said would require multiple surgeries and might still leave him disabled for life. "We prayed to Our Lady of Fatima every day," she said, "and when he went in for his final pre-surgical evaluation, the doctors found that the defect had completely disappeared. They couldn't explain it, but we knew what had happened." Thomas Bradley, a local firefighter, shared how he had been trapped in a burning building 2 years earlier when part of the ceiling collapsed, pinning him under heavy debris, with no way for his team to reach him quickly enough. "I thought I was going to die in there," he said, "but I started praying to Our Lady, asking her to help me get home to my wife and kids. Suddenly, I felt this incredible strength, and I was able to lift debris that should have been impossible for one person to move. When my captain asked how I got out, I told him I had help, and he didn't ask any more questions because he understood exactly what I meant." These conversations continued long into the evening, and I realized that my experience was not unique or isolated. All around me were ordinary people who had encountered the extraordinary, who had witnessed healings and interventions that defied rational explanation, but who rarely spoke about these. experiences because they feared being dismissed as delusional or overly emotional. My testimony had given them permission to acknowledge what they had seen and felt, to celebrate the miracles that had touched their lives, even when they couldn't prove them in a laboratory or document them in peer-reviewed journals. The months following my public testimony brought unexpected opportunities to share my story beyond the walls of St. Anthony's. I was invited to speak at medical conferences about the integration of spiritual care into modern healthcare, at interfaith gatherings focused on healing and hope, and at universities where students were exploring the intersection of science and faith. Each speaking engagement taught me something new about the hunger that exists in our society for meaning that goes beyond material success and technological advancement. During this period, I also began to notice changes in my surgical practice that went beyond improved bedside manner and increased compassion. There were cases where my intuition guided me to make decisions that seemed to contradict standard protocols, but that ultimately led to better outcomes for my patients. I would find myself drawn to check on certain patients at odd hours, only to discover developing complications that we were able to address immediately because of the early intervention. Surgical procedures that should have been routine became opportunities for what I can only describe as inspired medicine, where everything flowed with an almost supernatural precision and grace. One particularly memorable case involved Robert Washington, a retired teacher who came to us with multiple blockages in his coronary arteries that required an extremely complex bypass surgery. The procedure was expected to take at least 6 hours and carried significant risks, given his age and the extent of his cardiovascular disease. As I prepared for surgery that morning, I found myself praying in a way that had become natural to me, asking Our Lady of Fatima to guide my hands and grant us wisdom throughout the operation. The surgery progressed with an almost choreographed perfection that surprised even my experienced team. Every incision was clean, every graft took perfectly, and what should have been a 6-hour ordeal was completed in just under 4 hours, with results that exceeded our most optimistic projections. When Robert woke up in recovery, his first words were, "Doctor, I had the most beautiful dream while I was under anesthesia. There was a woman in white who told me everything was going to be fine, and she was right, wasn't she?" I assured him that everything had gone perfectly, but privately I wondered if his dream had been something more than the random firings of an anesthetized brain. My relationship with my own family continued to deepen and evolve as well. Emma, now 10 years old, had developed a genuine love for attending Mass and had become fascinated with the stories of the saints, particularly the 3 shepherd children of Fatima, who had received the miraculous visions over a century ago. She would ask me to tell her again and again about what I had seen in the operating room, and her childlike faith and wonder helped me to appreciate the magnitude of the gift I had received. James, approaching his 14th birthday, had decided that he wanted to follow in my footsteps and become a doctor, but with a twist that reflected the changes in our family's spiritual life. "Dad," he told me one evening as we worked together on his science homework, "I want to be the kind of doctor who helps people's bodies get better, but who also helps them understand that healing comes from God too." His simple statement captured perfectly what I had been learning through my own transformation: that faith and science are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a greater truth about healing, hope, and the mysterious ways that divine love operates in our world. Jennifer had perhaps benefited most from the changes in our family's spiritual life. She had always been more open to faith than I had been, but my skepticism and scientific materialism had created a barrier between us that we had both learned to work around rather than address directly. Now, with that barrier removed, we found ourselves able to share aspects of life that had previously been off limits in our relationship. We prayed together, attended retreats for married couples, and discovered that our marriage was capable of depths of intimacy and mutual support that we had never imagined possible. 1 year after my testimony at St. Anthony's, Father Rodriguez asked me to consider taking on a more formal role in the parish's ministry to the sick and suffering. "We have many people who are facing serious illnesses," he explained, "and while I can offer them spiritual comfort, there's something powerful about hearing hope from someone who understands medicine as well as faith." I agreed to begin visiting hospitalized parishioners, not as their doctor, but as someone who could offer a unique perspective on the relationship between healing and hope. These hospital visits became some of the most meaningful work of my life. I would sit with families facing devastating diagnoses, pray with patients preparing for major surgeries, and share my own story with those who seemed ready to hear it. Many of these conversations led to their own small miracles, not always physical healings, but emotional and spiritual transformations that brought peace in the midst of suffering and hope in the face of uncertainty. During one such visit, I met Catherine Murphy, a 45-year-old mother of 3 who was battling advanced ovarian cancer. Her prognosis was grim, and she had exhausted most conventional treatment options. When I first visited her, she was angry, frightened, and struggling to understand why God would allow such suffering in her life. We talked for hours over several visits, and I shared not only my own story but also the stories of others I had met who had found meaning and even joy in the midst of their trials. Catherine decided to make a pilgrimage to Fatima in Portugal, despite her weakened condition and her family's concerns about the physical demands of travel. She returned 3 weeks later with a radiance that was immediately apparent to everyone who knew her. Her latest medical tests showed that the cancer had not progressed as expected, but more importantly, she had found a peace and acceptance that transformed her remaining time with her family into a period of profound love and connection that her husband later described as a gift beyond measure. As I reflect on the 4 years that have passed since that transformative afternoon in the operating room at Cleveland Metropolitan Hospital, I am amazed by how completely my understanding of life, death, healing, and purpose has been revolutionized. Today, at 42 years old, I continue to practice cardiac surgery with the same dedication to excellence that has always characterized my work. But now that dedication is infused with a humility and sense of divine partnership that has made me not just a better surgeon, but a more complete human being. Every morning before I enter the hospital, I stop at the small chapel that was built adjacent to the medical center 3 years ago. Largely through the efforts of families who had experienced what they could only describe as miraculous healings during their time as patients. I kneeled before the statue of Our Lady of Fatima that was donated by the Mitchell family, and I placed my hands in hers, asking for guidance, wisdom, and the grace to be an instrument of healing for whatever challenges the day might bring. That small medallion that Rebecca Mitchell gave me now hangs around my neck beneath my scrubs, a constant reminder that I am never alone in the operating room, that skilled hands and advanced medical technology are powerful tools, but they are most effective when guided by something greater than human knowledge alone. My children have grown into remarkable young people who have been shaped by witnessing their father's spiritual journey. Emma, now 13, has become deeply involved in our parish's youth ministry and has announced her intention to become a pediatric nurse, inspired by what she calls the healing mission that God gives to people who want to help others feel better in their bodies and their hearts. James, at 16, has maintained his goal of following me into medicine, but he has also developed a passion for medical missions work, spending his summer breaks volunteering at free clinics in underserved communities throughout Ohio and talking about plans to someday provide medical care in developing countries where faith and healing often intersect in ways that Western medicine is only beginning to understand. Jennifer and I celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary last month, and we both agreed that the last 4 years have been the richest and most fulfilling of our entire marriage. We have traveled together to Fatima twice, experiences that deepened our faith individually and as a couple in ways that continue to influence every aspect of our daily lives. We volunteered together at a local hospice, providing comfort to families facing the loss of loved ones, and Jennifer has begun training as a grief counselor. Inspired by the peace and hope she has seen me able to offer to families during the most difficult moments of their lives. The medical community's response to my public testimony and integration of faith into my practice has been mixed but generally respectful. Some colleagues remain skeptical of what they consider unscientific approaches to healing, but many others have privately shared their own experiences of unexplained recoveries, moments of inspired medical decision-making, and encounters with the transcendent during their careers. Dr. Patricia Williams, my longtime anesthesiologist and surgical partner, recently told me that she has begun incorporating what she calls mindful presence into her work, taking moments before each surgery to center herself and open her heart to whatever grace might be needed for the patient under our care. The hospital administration, initially concerned about potential liability issues related to discussions of faith and miracles, has gradually embraced what they now call our holistic approach to patient care. Our cardiac surgery unit has some of the best outcomes in the region. Our patient satisfaction scores are consistently among the highest in the hospital system, and we have been featured in several medical journals as an example of how compassion and excellent clinical care can work together to optimize healing outcomes. More importantly, we have become a destination for patients and families who are seeking not just medical expertise, but the kind of hope and human connection that can make the difference between mere survival and genuine healing. Sarah Mitchell, the young woman whose miraculous recovery started my journey of transformation, graduated from Ohio State University last spring with a degree in biomedical engineering and has been accepted to medical school at Case Western Reserve University. She stops by the hospital periodically to visit with the staff who cared for her, and her presence always brings smiles and renewed sense of purpose to everyone who remembers that extraordinary day when death was reversed and a family's faith was vindicated. She has told me that she plans to specialize in pediatric cardiology, inspired by her own experience and by her desire to offer hope to children and families facing the kind of crisis that once brought her to our operating room. Ripple effects of that single miraculous event have continued to spread in ways that I could never have anticipated. Through my speaking engagements and hospital ministry, I have met countless individuals who have shared their own stories of divine intervention, unexplained healings, and moments when they felt the presence of Our Lady of Fatima, guiding them through times of crisis. These encounters have convinced me that what I experienced was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger pattern of divine love and care that is constantly operating in our world, usually unnoticed but occasionally breaking through in ways that cannot be ignored or explained away. Last month, I had the privilege of operating on Father Rodriguez from St. Anthony's, who required emergency surgery for a massive heart attack that should have been fatal, given the extent of the damage to his cardiac muscle. As I prepared for what I knew would be an extremely challenging procedure with uncertain outcomes, I found myself praying more fervently than ever before, asking Our Lady of Fatima to intercede for this holy priest who had guided so many people, including my own family, closer to God through his faithful ministry. The surgery took nearly 7 hours, but when it was completed, Father Rodriguez's heart was beating strongly, and all his vital signs were stable. When he woke up in the cardiac intensive care unit, his first words were directed to me. "Michael, I saw her too. She was there with us in the operating room, wasn't she?" I nodded, unable to speak around the emotion in my throat, because I had indeed felt that familiar presence, that golden light, that sense of divine assistance that had become such an integral part of my most challenging cases. Father Rodriguez recovered completely and returned to his parish duties within 6 weeks, his experience adding another chapter to the growing collection of stories about miraculous healings associated with our cardiac surgery program. As I prepare to share this testimony with you today, I am filled with gratitude for the journey that began with my stubborn skepticism and has led me to a life of faith, purpose, and service that I could never have imagined when I was the arrogant young surgeon who thought he had all the answers. I have learned that true healing involves not just the repair of damaged hearts and arteries, but the restoration of hope, the strengthening of faith, and the reminder that we are all part of something much larger and more beautiful than our individual struggles and achievements. The medallion around my neck grows warm against my chest as I speak these words, and I am reminded once again that Our Lady of Fatima continues to watch over all of us who dedicate our lives to healing others. She sees the tears of every frightened family in every hospital waiting room. She hears the prayers of every patient facing an uncertain diagnosis, and she guides the hands of every healthcare worker who approaches their calling with humility and love. My message to anyone who hears this testimony is simple. Miracles are real. Faith and science can work together in beautiful harmony, and no one is ever beyond the reach of divine love and healing grace. Whether you are a patient facing a serious illness, a family member watching a loved one suffer, or a healthcare professional wondering if your work truly makes a difference, remember that you are not alone in your struggles and your efforts to bring healing to our broken world. If this story has touched your heart today, I want to invite you to join our growing community of faith and hope by subscribing to this channel and hitting that notification bell. Your subscription helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages of divine love and miraculous healing. In the comments below, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with faith and healing. Have you ever witnessed something that couldn't be explained by medical science alone? Have you felt the presence of Our Lady of Fatima or another saint during a time of crisis? Please share your story, because every testimony of God's love and power encourages someone else who might be struggling with doubt or fear. I also want to invite you to tell us what this testimony has taught you or how it has affected your own relationship with faith and healing. Sometimes a single story can change the way we see our entire lives, and I believe that's exactly what Our Lady of Fatima intended when she chose to reveal herself in that operating room 4 years ago. Don't be afraid to share deeply and honestly. This community is a safe place for people who have experienced the miraculous and want to celebrate God's goodness together. Finally, if you've been moved by this story, please consider sharing it with someone you know who might need to hear about the power of faith and the reality of divine intervention in our modern world. Together, we can spread hope, encourage faith, and remind everyone that miracles are still happening all around us, every single day.